Hey, welcome! Today we're going to cover an approach for decoupling a component's semantic meaning from its visual style. Before we dive in, let's take a quick look at the basic demo app that we'll be working with here to use as an example. So here's the overall structure of the app that's being rendered, and today we're going to focus primarily on this form component. Even more specifically, we're going to look at these elements, the button, anchor, and the other anchor. And we're going to look at how we can convert this into a component or components. So let's start with the button because that's probably the most straightforward. Let's start by just copying the existing element into a component. And since we're using TypeScript, we'll define a type for the props in a second. Cool. And for now, we can say that this button will accept a string prop as the child, since for right now we don't need anything other than a string. And then let's also go ahead and add the other attributes that we know we'll need. So we'll need some way of rendering a variant, such as button primary, button secondary, button link, whatever it might be. So let's start by adding that as well. We only need to add a subset since we're not using all of the variants that Bootstrap provides. I'm also going to mark it as optional because we can default to primary or whichever variant we'd like. And then additionally, we also have this block attribute here, which not all buttons need. So let's make that an opt-in. Cool, so now we have the basic attributes that we need. Let's also expose the type here because we may need type button or type submit. And I'm also going to make that optional because I'm also going to default that since it's often easily forgotten when working with buttons. And I'm going to make the default button since that's generally what you'll end up using. So button's the default for the type. Primary is the default for variant, and block default is false. So now we can add all of these in. So normally for generating class names that are kind of dynamic like this, I would reach for like the class names package, but for the purpose of this, let's use some conditionals to keep this example simpler without adding additional dependencies. So all buttons need the button class and then their respective variant. And then if it's a block button, we will add the button block class. Cool, so, forgot the children. Perfect. Now, we should be able to convert this to our button component. We need to define type submit because it's defaulting to button. We need to define, well, we don't need to define our variant because that's defaulting to primary, and it is a block button. So let's go ahead and save that. Perfect. So now we have a basic component that represents a button. And right now it's directly coupled to the button element. So let's look at our anchors now. So if we did something similar, we would probably make either an anchor component or a link component. So let's go ahead and start by making a link component for each of these anchors. So I'll rename this link. It needs the same attributes for styling. Does not need a type, but it does need an href. And these will be link props. Let's copy the interface as well since it's mostly unchanged. Link props. Make that required. Cool, now we can switch out the element for an anchor. Pass in the href prop. And now we should similarly have a basic component for the link. Perfect. So the case that we haven't handled quite yet is this anchor. And because it's Bootstrap, it doesn't have an explicit variant. Instead, it's globally styled. So let's make up a fake variant. And if that variant is passed, we'll simply not apply any styling. So let's call this an inline link. And then we only need to apply these if the variant is not the inline link. And now we should be able to use this component here, inline link. Cool. So we now have a link component, but it looks like we have a few issues here. So let's look at what's going on here. So it looks like we're missing a space there. So whenever we're appending these, we want to make sure we put a space before those because they're distinct class names. And now we have one more issue. Oh, undefined. So if neither of these, or we're appending to undefined, so we need to define this as an empty string so that we're not appending to undefined. And then this is no longer block, or sorry, this is no longer primary. We want the link variant. Perfect. So now just to double check, if we change this to primary, we're going to get a big button over there. Secondary link, but we want inline link. Perfect. Cool. So now you can see that we have two basic components, a link component for all anchors and then a button component that represents all buttons. But as you can see, there's a lot of logic in here that's actually somewhat duplicated, and these are already getting out of sync. So the inline link is supported by the link, but not the button. And although it has link in the name, you may want to render a button in this style variant because currently this is going to / forgot password. But what if in the future this instead opens a modal where you enter your password? Now we need that to be a button. So we could consider trying to convert this anchor semantically to a button by adding the proper aria and role attributes to make sure that it's accessible to users, but it's just a lot easier to use an actual button. So to do that, we'd now have to copy this logic, add the new variant, and change this component to a button. So that's a lot of work for something that didn't visually change, and we only want to change the semantics. Similarly, down here we have the sign up, and it's directing you to /sign up. But what if instead this form toggled? We'd also have to convert this to a button component. So we're starting to run into a lot of challenges with this approach. So we've explicitly decoupled the underlying elements, but now we have to maintain two things, and anytime we need to switch between them, it's a pretty big effort to switch between the components and keep them in sync. So what if instead we combine these into a single component? So we'll start with the button component and merge this into there. Actually, we need both of these. This has one more variant. Perfect. But now the challenge is we're accepting this type attribute, which is only valid for buttons, and we also need an href attribute. So we could add those and make them both optional. So we could add an href like this, add an href attribute up here. But now this is somewhat unfortunate because it's not type safe in the sense that you can add type and href. And you can really only have one of these attributes. Additionally, the href attribute is required on anchors, or at least in our component it is. So we also won't get the warning anymore from TypeScript because we've marked it optional, so it no longer is required. So is there a way that we can only allow these corresponding attributes for the underlying element and also have the proper type safety? So since we only want to render one of the elements, we can instead create distinct interfaces for each. So we want to have an anchor button props, and this will be the props for a button that is rendered as an anchor. I like to name the props and options in the same way that you would say it. So since we just said an anchor button or a button as an anchor, we can use the as prop to say we're rendering this as an anchor. And then now it has an href attribute that is required, and then it has all of the styling attributes, which we'll do in a second. And then we have a button that is rendered as a button, which the naming might be a little misleading. And I think at this point, we've now decoupled the button component from the button element, and instead this is more of a design concept of a clickable element. And if you think about it, a distinction between a button element and an anchor element is an implementation detail, and often from the design perspective or even other platforms, we don't need to make that distinction. So this is much more of a design system concept of a clickable element that the user interacts with, and whether or not that's a button element or anchor element often doesn't matter to the user or designer, but it is important to make sure that they are semantically correct for people using screen readers and ensuring that your site is accessible. So we can go ahead here and finish the button as a button, and this is still optional. So now we can remove the element specific ones. And now this is really shared button props or visual button props, if you will. So these are the props that all elements accept, and it's purely the design aspect. So now we've decoupled the styling from the semantics, but we still haven't defined the button props interface or type. So button props can now be anchor button props or button props. But we still have one issue in that these are strictly only these options or these options and not the visual options. So we'll extend both of those, and now you're seeing we're getting type errors here because type doesn't exist on type button props and href doesn't, and it does, but only in these specific ones. So when we're looking at this, it can be this or this, and because href is only in one of them and type is in only one of them, it's not guaranteed to be in button props. So that's why we're getting this type error here. So instead of doing this, let's just keep this props, and let's destructure only the attributes that are always set. So variant, children, block, those are always set. So we can safely destructure those immediately. Cool. But now we are still only rendering a button. So let's create a switch statement here. And we're going to switch on the as attribute. The as attribute can either be an anchor or a button. So let's move this into our button. By default, we'll just return null. We'll revisit this in a second. Now we're returning an anchor element with an href. And now because we're using TypeScript and we're using a switch statement, TypeScript can narrow the type. So right now, as can be either an anchor element or button element. But when we're in this case for an anchor element, we have now narrowed the props to only an anchor button. So let's just look at this quick. So here you can see props is anchor button props, whereas up here, it's button props. And then down here, button props. So now we can safely destructure these other attributes that we need that are element specific. Oops. And then similarly for the button, we need the type attribute. Perfect. So now all of the visual logic is now shared. So now we don't have to worry about adding new variants, removing variants, whatever it might be. They both support the exact thing. And now it's all within a single component. So not only is this map more directly to how a user generally interacts with the button or how design generally kind of thinks about buttons, but now when we change between these elements but want the same visual treatment, we no longer need to swap the component, and it's all driven by this as attribute. So let's update all of these and add the corresponding as attributes. And that's actually an anchor. Perfect. So now let's just inspect this here. So this is button, type submit, proper classes, anchor. Let's inspect this one. Anchor, perfect. So now if this changes to a button, we don't touch the styling attributes because those haven't changed. We change it to a button, and now you see we get this type error here. That href is not assignable because it doesn't exist in the button props interface. So now we can remove that because it's no longer an anchor. And similarly, if we say sign in now, it's actually going to take you to a new page. You can convert this to an anchor. And we now see that similarly type is not defined on anchor. But even cooler is now we're missing the href attribute, and since it's required, it also is erroring saying that we're missing the href attribute. So now we can completely change the underlying logic and semantics in terms of a button or an anchor element, but all of the visuals in terms of the component and the variant props and such do not need to change. Perfect. So we now have a button component that is effectively decoupled the visual aspects from the semantic aspects. One other thing I mentioned is I was going to come back to here. So in the future, if we, for whatever reason, added another variant, and for the purpose of a button, it's probably not realistic that you would want to render anything other than an anchor in a button element, but using this pattern in other components, it's likely that you could have a third or fourth option, and maybe those options will change over time and you don't want to add them before you have a use case. So let's create a new test button props that extends shared button props, and it's rendered as a test. So now if you rendered a button as test, we're not getting a type error. Instead, we're going to get a runtime error because we haven't, actually not a runtime error, we're just not going to render anything because we haven't defined a case for test. So now there's nothing here, whereas if we did an anchor, it shows up, but rendering it as test shows nothing because we're switching on the as prop. Doesn't match an anchor element, doesn't match a button element, default return null. So what we can do here is missing it from there, but it still has the same problem. So what we can do is use an exhaustiveness check from TypeScript. And what we can do is say that we expect that this function receives a value of never, meaning no value should ever be passed to this function. And then if this is ever hit, we can throw at runtime unexpected value. And then we can add this into here. And we're going to pass the props as attribute. Before we added this, we can actually just pass all of props. So props is now never because we've exhausted all of the valid options for props. It can be anchor button props, which is case A, button props, case button, or nothing else is ever left, so it's never. But now when we add test down here, you can see. So this is kind of unfortunate because we're passing the entire props object. So converting that to a string is printed like this, which isn't ideal, but it conveys the idea that we're hitting this default case because we're passing test. But this is already producing a compile time error because test is not a valid option. But what if we made test a valid option now? Now this code's valid down here, but now we get a type error down here saying that test button props is not assignable to type never because we haven't handled that case. So if we explicitly handled test and returned, say, a div with the word test in it, the exhaustiveness check goes away. So this is a nice way to ensure that as the as prop changes over time, that you're always creating a type error in the correct place so that either the case is always handled, you're not allowed to pass invalid options, etc. So let's remove this test logic here quick and just look at the final solution. So if you recall, when we first started, we had an anchor element here, we had a button element here, we had an anchor element here, and we were talking about the effort it would take to kind of switch these between buttons and anchors in the different visual styles. And when there was the peer markup, it wasn't too bad because you can switch out the elements. But as soon as we started to encapsulate this into a button and a link component, it became a lot more effort to switch between those and ensure that those components stayed in sync. With this approach that we've ended on, we've decoupled the semantic or underlying element via the as prop, and then the corresponding attributes that correspond to that as attribute or element that's being rendered from the visual styles that don't need to change or do not depend on the underlying element. So this is a good approach for a component that may need to render multiple elements and may need to accept different attributes depending on what kind of element, but all of them share the same styles. So an alternative approach may be to create a bunch of different components. As with anything, I don't think this pattern should be applied to every component, but rather it's a pattern to keep in mind when you run into this type of specific problem and need to handle this case. Let me know in the comments if you have any examples of components that you think could benefit from this approach, and thanks for watching today's video.